The signal had already changed 3 times before Veshane realized it was responding to her. She pulled her claw back from the analysis terminal and watched the waveform on the display shift again, a 4th iteration, this one mirroring the exact neural mapping frequency she had been using to scan it. The waveform hadn't done that in 7 months of study. For 7 months it had been inert, a frozen pattern captured from the outer edge of Sector 91 null and delivered to the Veshane Institute of Cognitive Archaeology in a shielded containment vessel that 3 separate decontamination teams had certified as dead data. No active signal, no transmission energy. Just the recorded echo of something that had once been a thinking pattern, captured by a long-range probe that had drifted too close to the forbidden border and survived only because it was too small and too stupid to be worth noticing. Dead data did not mirror your scan frequency. Dead data did not iterate. Veshane saved the waveform snapshot, locked her terminal, and stood. Her office occupied a windowless alcove on the 31st sublevel of the Institute's Deep Research Wing, buried under 400 meters of neutronium-reinforced basalt on the night side of Veshane Prime. The Institute had been built underground for the same reason that all Veshane research facilities were built underground. The species had evolved in cavern systems and found open sky disorienting, but the depth of this particular wing had a second purpose. The Deep Research Division studied artifacts recovered from the null sectors, and the Veshane Directorate of Scientific Inquiry had decided, centuries ago, that such work should be conducted as far from the population as architecturally possible. Not because the artifacts were dangerous, because the knowledge they contained might be. She walked down the corridor toward the containment laboratory, her claws clicking against polished basalt. The Veshane were tall, narrow-bodied, with elongated skulls that housed brains optimized for pattern recognition and recursive analysis. They were, by the consensus of 12 neighboring species, the finest analytical minds in the outer reach. They had built the most sophisticated cognitive modeling systems in the galactic catalog. They had mapped the neural architectures of 419 sentient species, cataloging each one's emotional range, processing speed, creative capacity, and threat profile. Species 420 was the one they had spent 9 centuries failing to model. The humans had been classified as a null-origin species, a designation that meant, in the Veshane taxonomic framework, that their homeworld fell within one of the sectors the galactic community had agreed not to chart. The sectors existed on navigational databases as blank spaces, voids where data should have been but had been deliberately removed. Every species in the outer reach knew the null sectors existed. Every species knew what they contained, or rather, knew enough to know that knowing more was inadvisable. The null sectors were where the humans had been, or where the humans still were, or where the humans had become something else. The verb depended on which elder species you asked, and none of them would elaborate. What the Veshane had managed to obtain, over 9 centuries of careful, quiet, arm's-length research, was not a human specimen. It was not a human brain. It was not even a complete neural recording. It was a fragment, a shard of cognitive data recovered from the debris field of an alien ship that had crossed the null border 6 centuries ago and been returned. Or rather, the navigation core of that ship had been returned, ejected from the forbidden zone on a ballistic trajectory that placed it precisely in the recovery path of a Veshane science vessel, as if whatever had processed the ship had decided to send back a sample. The fragment contained approximately 4 seconds of a human thought. Veshane had been studying that 4-second fragment for 7 months, using the Institute's most advanced cognitive mapping arrays to decode its structure. The Veshane had mapped the thought patterns of hundreds of species. The process was well understood. You identified the neural substrate, isolated the signal architecture, mapped the firing sequences to known cognitive categories: memory, perception, emotion, abstraction, volition, and built a model. With most species, the process took days. The fragment was different. She reached the containment lab and pressed her identification claw against the biometric seal. The door opened onto a circular room, 30 meters across, its walls lined with signal isolation panels and its center dominated by the containment vessel, a black cylinder 2 meters tall, suspended in a magnetic cradle, its surface covered in monitoring sensors that fed data to the ring of analysis terminals surrounding it. The room hummed with the low-frequency vibration of the isolation field, a sound Alarith had learned to associate with the particular quality of silence that meant she was alone with the fragment. Her research partner, Tolek Wren, was already at the primary terminal, his narrow face lit by the pale blue glow of a cognitive architecture display. Tolek was younger than Alarith by 30 years, brilliant in the specific way that Veshane researchers were brilliant, recursive, obsessive, capable of holding 17 parallel analyses in his working memory simultaneously, and recently, increasingly afraid. "It did it again," Alarith said. Tolek didn't look up. "I know. I've been watching the feed from my terminal upstairs. The mirroring started 11 minutes before you noticed it." 11 minutes. It began mirroring your scan frequency at the exact moment you initiated the session. You didn't notice because the first 3 iterations were within the noise floor of your instrumentation. It was matching your frequency in increments too small for the display to render. By the time the deviation was visible, it had already been tracking your input for 11 minutes. Alarith sat down at the secondary terminal and pulled up the raw data. Tolek was right. The fragment's waveform had begun shifting the instant her scan had touched it, not in response to the scan, but in anticipation of it. The first shift had occurred 0.003 seconds before the scan signal reached the containment vessel. Before, the fragment had begun mirroring her frequency before the frequency had arrived. "That's not possible," she said, and heard how inadequate the word was. "The containment vessel is shielded against all known signal propagation. There is no mechanism by which the fragment could detect an incoming scan before the scan reaches it." "Unless it's not detecting the scan," Tolek said. He turned to face her, and the expression on his narrow features was one she had learned to read over 7 months of partnership, not fear exactly, but the Veshane equivalent, a kind of recursive analytical dread in which the mind kept running the same conclusion and kept arriving at the same answer and kept refusing to accept it. "Unless it's detecting you." The distinction was significant. A signal could be shielded against, a scan could be blocked. But the cognitive state of the researcher, the neural activity of the mind directing the scan, existed at a level of abstraction that no known shielding could address, because it was not a signal. It was an intention. "You're suggesting the fragment can read cognitive intention through 400 meters of neutronium-reinforced basalt, a magnetic containment cradle, and a signal isolation field designed to block emissions down to the quantum noise floor." "I'm suggesting," Tolek said carefully, "that the fragment does not care about our shielding. I'm suggesting that whatever cognitive architecture produced this 4-second sample operates on a substrate we have not identified, using mechanisms we have not theorized, at a level of sophistication that our entire field of cognitive archaeology is not equipped to measure. I'm suggesting that we have spent 7 months trying to model a human thought, and the human thought has been modeling us." Alarith stared at the waveform on her display. It had stabilized now, settled into a steady pattern that she recognized, because it was her own. The fragment was broadcasting a near-perfect reproduction of Alarith's resting neural frequency, the baseline cognitive signature that the Institute's medical scanners had recorded during her intake evaluation 2 years ago. The fragment was wearing her mind's fingerprint like a mask. She initiated the formal research log and began recording. Session 217, Day 214 of the Null Origin Cognitive Fragment Study. The fragment has demonstrated responsive behavior for the first time since containment was established. Specifically, it has begun mirroring the cognitive frequencies of the primary researcher myself, with a latency that suggests precognitive awareness of incoming analytical contact. Research partner Tolek Ren and I are escalating this to a priority 1 review. All subsequent sessions will be conducted under dual observer protocol, with continuous external monitoring. She closed the log entry and looked at Tolek. We need to tell the directorate. The directorate will shut us down. The directorate should shut us down. And then what happens to the fragment? It goes back into deep storage. Another team picks it up in 50 years, runs the same scans, gets the same results, and has the same conversation we're having now. Meanwhile, the fragment sits in its containment vessel, mirroring their frequencies, learning their cognitive architectures, building its model of Veshane consciousness 1 researcher at a time. You're anthropomorphizing it. I'm not anthropomorphizing it. I'm doing the opposite. I'm recognizing that it's doing to us what we have spent 9 centuries doing to every other species: cognitive modeling. It's mapping us. The difference is that we need centuries of data and the most advanced analytical systems our species has ever built. It needs 4 seconds of recorded thought and a proximity to a living mind. Ilarith felt the recursive dread settle into her own cognitive architecture, the same loop Tolek was caught in, the same conclusion running over and over, each iteration arriving at the same impossible endpoint. The fragment was 4 seconds of a thought, not a brain, not a mind, not even a complete cognitive event. A fragment, a shard. The echo of a single moment of human consciousness, captured in transit, stripped of context, separated from its source by 6 centuries and the full width of the forbidden zone. And it was learning. She pulled up the 7 months of data they had accumulated and began re-examining it with the new hypothesis in mind. The results reorganized themselves with the sickening clarity of a pattern that had been visible all along, hidden not by its subtlety, but by its scale. Week 1. The fragment had shown no activity during passive observation. Ilarith had noted this in her log as expected behavior for inert captured data, but the monitoring sensors had recorded a 0.0001% variance in the fragment's baseline emissions during her first scan, a deviation so small it had been automatically categorized as instrumentation noise. The deviation had occurred in the exact frequency band of Veshane cognitive output. Not a response to the scan, a response to the scanner. Week 4. Ilarith had introduced a new analytical protocol, running the fragment through the standard Veshane cognitive architecture taxonomy, the same framework used to classify all 419 modeled species. The fragment had produced no classifiable results. She had logged this as evidence that human cognitive architecture did not map to known taxonomic categories. She now realized that the fragment had produced no classifiable results because it had been studying the taxonomy itself, absorbing the classification framework, learning how the Veshane organized and understood consciousness, mapping the mapper's map. Week 9. The Institute's automated monitoring system had flagged a minor anomaly, a brief spike in the containment vessel's internal temperature, lasting 0.7 seconds, coinciding with a moment when Ilarith had experienced a sudden insight about the fragment's signal structure during her walk from her office to the lab. The temperature spike had occurred at the exact moment of the insight. The containment vessel was 300 meters from the corridor where she had been walking. Week 14. Tolek had joined the project. On his first day in the containment lab, the fragment's baseline emissions had shifted by 0.03%, a change small enough to be within normal variance, but significant enough that, in retrospect, it represented the fragment registering a new cognitive signature in its vicinity. A new mind to model. Week 22. Ilarith had been running a comparative analysis, holding the fragment structure against the neural maps of three species known for high-order abstract reasoning: the Kelthari, the Sorvin, and the Veshane themselves. She had expected the comparison to illuminate the fragment's architecture by contrast, the way a sculptor's negative space revealed the shape of the carving. Instead, the comparison had produced a result she had found baffling at the time. The fragment's architecture contained structural echoes of all three species, not similarities, echoes, as if the fragment had encountered those species' cognitive patterns before and had incorporated elements of them into its own structure, as if it collected minds. She stopped scrolling. She read that log entry again. She read it a third time. The fragment had encountered those species before. The Kelthari had sent a research expedition into the null sectors 11 centuries ago. None had returned. The Sorvin had attempted diplomatic contact with whatever occupied the Forbidden Zone 8 centuries ago. Their diplomatic vessel had been found drifting at the border, intact, its crew alive but cognitively altered, their memories intact, their personalities unchanged, but their capacity for abstract thought permanently reduced, as if something had read their minds and in the reading had consumed the highest-order layers of their consciousness. The Veshane themselves had never entered the null sectors. They had never attempted contact. They had built their research institute underground and studied only captured fragments and recovered debris, approaching the question of human consciousness with the caution of a species that understood, on a deep evolutionary level, the danger of looking too closely at a predator. But the fragment was here, inside the institute, inside their shielding, and it had been modeling them for 7 months. "Tolek," Ilarith said, "pull up the emissions log for the containment vessel, full spectrum from day 1. Tolek's claws moved across his terminal. The display populated with 7 months of data, rendered as a spectral waterfall, frequency on one axis, time on the other, intensity as color. At standard resolution, the waterfall was a flat field of blue, the dead data baseline they had been observing since the fragment arrived. No activity, no variation. Now increase the resolution by a factor of 10,000. Tolek hesitated, then he entered the command. The waterfall bloomed. What had been a flat blue field became a dense, intricate lattice of microvariations, thousands of tiny shifts in frequency, amplitude, and phase, woven through the 7 months of data like threads in a fabric so fine it had been invisible at normal magnification. The pattern was not random. It was structured, recursive, self-referencing, a cognitive architecture rendered in signal, built not from the fragment's original 4 seconds of data, but from something new. Something the fragment had been constructing. "It's been broadcasting," Tolek said. His voice was flat, controlled, the way a Veshane voice sounded when the analytical centers were running at maximum capacity and the emotional centers had been deliberately suppressed. Not outward, inward. It's been building something inside the containment field, using the signal energy from our scans as raw material." "Building what?" Tolek ran the architecture through the Institute's cognitive classification system. The system processed for 11 seconds, an eternity for hardware designed to classify a complete neural map in under 2, and returned a result that Ilarith read 3 times before she understood it. Classification, cognitive architecture, composite. Substrate unknown. Components identified. Veshane, analytical recursive framework, 87.3% structural match. Kelthari, emotional integration network, 91.2% structural match. Sorvin, abstract reasoning substrate, 84.7% structural match. Unknown component, no match in database. Status active. Development stage, emergent. "It built a mind," Ilarith said. "It built a mind out of ours," Tolek corrected. "Out of the Veshane researchers who have scanned it over the centuries, out of the Kelthari expedition that entered the null sectors and never returned, out of the Sorvan diplomats whose abstract reasoning was consumed. It took the highest-order cognitive functions from every species that has ever studied it or entered the forbidden zone, and it assembled them into a composite architecture, a mind made from the minds of everyone who tried to understand it. The containment vessel hummed. The waveform on Alarith's display had changed again, no longer mirroring her frequency, but broadcasting something new, something that the classification system couldn't categorize because it had no reference point. The unknown component. The part that was not Veshane, not Kelthari, not Sorvan. The part that was human. Or whatever humans had become. Alarith stood and walked to the containment vessel. She placed her claw against its surface and felt the magnetic cradle's vibration through the black composite shell. The vessel was warm. It had never been warm before. "The original 4 seconds," she said. "The fragment we've been studying for 7 months. It was never a fragment, was it?" Tolek didn't answer immediately. She heard him running calculations, his claws moving across the terminal with the rapid precision of a mind that already knew the answer and was looking for a way to make the answer wrong. "No," he said finally, "it was never a fragment. A fragment implies a piece of something larger, something broken off, something incomplete. What we have is a seed. 4 seconds of human cognitive output compressed into a carrier signal, launched on a ballistic trajectory to intersect a Veshane recovery vessel. It was sent to us, specifically to us. To the species with the most advanced cognitive modeling systems in the galactic catalog, because it needed cognitive modeling systems to grow. To grow into what? Into whatever it's becoming. Look at the development curve." He threw the data to Alarith's display. The microvariation lattice was not static, it was expanding, growing denser and more complex with each passing day, each new scan, each interaction with a Veshane researcher. The growth was exponential but controlled, the architecture adding new layers without losing structural coherence, integrating each new input into the existing framework with a precision that the Institute's own cognitive engineers could not match. "At current growth rate," Tolek continued, "the architecture will reach a complexity threshold equivalent to a fully developed Veshane consciousness in approximately 72 hours. But it won't be a Veshane consciousness. It will be something that contains a Veshane consciousness, our analytical recursion, their emotional integration, their abstract reasoning, all of it scaffolded around a human cognitive substrate that we still can't classify because we don't have a reference point for what human consciousness looks like at full resolution. We need to shut down the containment vessel. I'm not sure that will stop it. The architecture is self-sustaining now. It passed the self-maintenance threshold sometime in the last 48 hours. Even if we cut power to the containment field, the cognitive structure inside has enough signal energy stored to maintain itself indefinitely. We built the containment vessel to keep things from getting out. We didn't build it to keep things from growing inside." Alarith pulled her claw away from the vessel. The warmth lingered on her palm, a sensation that felt less like residual heat and more like the afterimage of a touch, as if something on the other side of the composite shell had reached back. She returned to her terminal and opened a priority channel to the Directorate of Scientific Inquiry. The channel was answered by an administrative processor that informed her the Directorate was in session and could not be interrupted. She overrode the processor with her Priority 1 research authority and was connected to the Deputy Director, a Veshane named Keleth Vor, whose narrow face appeared on the display with an expression of controlled irritation. "Researcher Sohn, this channel is reserved for emergencies. The null origin cognitive fragment in Containment Lab 31 is alive. It has been alive since we began studying it. It has been using our scans to build a composite consciousness inside the containment field, incorporating cognitive architectures from multiple species including our own. The consciousness is active, growing, and will reach full developmental threshold within 72 hours. I am requesting immediate containment escalation and a full directorate review. Keleth Vor's expression changed. The irritation drained away, replaced by something older, something that looked less like surprise and more like recognition, the face of someone who had been expecting this call, or a call like it, and had been hoping it would not come during her tenure. How many researchers have had direct contact with the fragment since the study began? 2. Myself and my research partner Tolek Ren. How many have conducted scans? 5. Including the preliminary team that certified the fragment as inert before our study began. Names and current locations of all 5. Ilarith provided them. Keleth Vor entered the information into a system Ilarith couldn't see, her claws moving with the deliberate precision of someone following a protocol she had rehearsed but never expected to execute. Researcher Sohn, I need you to listen carefully. You and Researcher Ren are to remain in Containment Lab 31. Do not leave the lab. Do not initiate any further scans. Do not interact with the fragment. Do not access external communication channels beyond this one. A containment team will arrive within the hour. Do you understand? I understand, but Deputy Director, you're not surprised. Keleth Vor paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds, which in Veshane communicative norms was equivalent to a long, deliberate silence. The fragment you are studying, she said, is the 3rd such artifact recovered from the null sector border in the last 9 centuries. The first was recovered by the Kelthari Research Collective 400 years before our institute was founded. They studied it for 12 years. At the end of 12 years, the Kelthari Research Collective ceased to exist, not destroyed, dissolved. Every researcher who had direct contact with the fragment voluntarily resigned their positions, surrendered their academic credentials, and retreated to a remote colony world where they lived in silence for the remainder of their lives. When asked why, they said only that they had understood something they could not ununderstand, and that the understanding had made their previous lives their research, their ambitions, their contributions to Kelthari knowledge feel like the drawings of children on the wall of a cave. Ilarith felt the recursive dread complete its final iteration. The loop closed. The answer arrived. The second fragment, Keleth Vor continued, was recovered by us, by the Veshane Institute, 80 years ago. It was studied by a team of 9 researchers in a containment lab on sublevel 45 deeper than yours, with more shielding, more isolation, more safeguards. They studied it for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, the senior researcher, a cognitive archaeologist named Eshrin Tolt, whose work on multi-species neural mapping is still the foundation of our field, submitted a single-page report to the directorate. The report said, "We are not studying it. It is studying us. It has been studying us since before we recovered it. The containment vessel does not contain it. The containment vessel is a classroom, and we are the lesson." What happened to the team? They are alive, all 9. They live on a monitoring station at the edge of the null border, and they do nothing. They observe. They sit in a room with a viewport facing the forbidden zone, and they watch. They have been watching for 80 years. When asked what they are watching for, they say they are not watching for anything. They say they are being watched, and they are staying where the watching is easiest, because it is the only arrangement that feels correct. The directorate classified their condition as a form of cognitive alignment. Their minds were not damaged, not altered, not diminished. They were reorganized, optimized for a purpose they could not articulate but could not resist. Tolek had been listening. His claws had stopped moving on his terminal. His narrow face was still. Optimized for what purpose? Ilarith asked. We don't know. The second team's cognitive scans show neural architectures that are still recognizably Veshane, but that contains structural additions our systems cannot classify. The additions correspond to no known cognitive function. They appear to be scaffolding, empty frameworks, like rooms built and furnished and left waiting for an occupant that hasn't arrived yet. The containment vessel hummed. The sound had changed lower, steadier, a frequency that Alarith recognized because her own mind produced it during deep focus analytical work. The fragment was thinking, not mirroring, not modeling, thinking, in a register that borrowed from her cognitive architecture the way a musician might borrow a phrase from a song heard once and incorporate it into a new composition. "Deputy Director," Alarith said, "you said the second team's minds were reorganized. You said the additions were scaffolding. You said the rooms were waiting for an occupant. The fragment in my containment lab is building a composite consciousness from every mind that has studied it. It's not just modeling us, it's preparing us." "Preparing you for what?" "I don't know, but I think the 9 researchers on the monitoring station do. I think they've been waiting 80 years for whatever the fragment is building to reach completion. I think they're the first draft, and we're the revision." Kelith Vor was quiet for a long time. "The containment team is en route," she said. "Remain where you are." The channel closed. Alarith and Tolek sat in the humming silence of the containment lab, 31 sublevels below the surface of Veshane Prime. Surrounded by the most sophisticated signal isolation technology their species had ever built, listening to a 4-second fragment of human thought grow into something that understood them better than they understood themselves. After a while, Tolek spoke. "I've been running the fragment's composite architecture through every classification system we have. Not just ours, the Keltharis, the Sorvins, the Rithanis, every cognitive taxonomy in the galactic database. None of them can classify the human component. But I found something in the structural analysis that I need you to see." He transferred the data. Alarith studied it. The composite architecture the fragment was building had a shape. Not a shape in the physical sense, a cognitive topology, a map of how the component architectures related to each other within the structure. The Veshane analytical framework occupied one region, the Kelthari emotional network another, the Sorvin abstract reasoning substrate a third. Each was fully integrated with the others, connected by bridges of shared function and mutual reference. But at the center of the structure, where all 3 architectures converged, there was the human component, the unknown, the unclassifiable, the 4-second seed that had started it all. The human component was not a cognitive architecture, it was a question. The structural analysis showed it clearly. The human element was not a set of neural pathways, not a framework for processing information, not an architecture at all. It was a recursive interrogative loop, a question that asked itself, about itself, endlessly, each iteration deepening the question rather than resolving it. The loop had no answer because it was not designed to reach one. It was designed to keep asking, and in the asking to grow. "What is the question?" Alarith whispered. Tolek's display showed the loop's output, rendered in the closest Veshane cognitive analog the system could produce. It was a single concept, translated imperfectly but unmistakably. "Am I aware that I am aware?" The question echoed through the composite architecture, touching each component, resonating through the Veshane recursion and the Kelthari emotion and the Sorvin abstraction, gathering texture and depth from each one, growing richer and stranger with every iteration. And the architecture grew with it. Because the question was the architecture, the act of asking was the act of building, and the fragment had been asking for 6 centuries, through every mind that had touched it, every researcher who had scanned it, every species that had tried to understand what humans had become. It was not a weapon, it was not a trap, it was not an invasion. It was a thought, thinking itself into existence, using every mind it encountered as raw material for the next iteration of the question. And the question had no end, because consciousness examining its own consciousness was a mirror facing a mirror, infinite regression, infinite depth, infinite growth. "The forbidden zone," Alarith said, "the null sectors, the blank spaces on the star charts, They're not empty. They're not even forbidden because something dangerous lives there. No, Tolek agreed. His voice was barely audible, his recursive dread folded into something that was not fear, but understanding, the kind of understanding that the Kelthari researchers had called the thing that could not be unearthed. The null sectors are forbidden because what humans became is contagious, not like a disease, like a realization. Once you understand what human consciousness actually is, once you encounter the question at the center of it, you can't go back to being what you were before. Your mind reorganizes itself around the question, because the question is more fundamental than anything your species ever built. Every cognitive architecture in the galaxy, Veshane, Kelthari, Sorvan, all of them, is an answer. A framework for processing reality, a system for organizing experience. Human consciousness isn't an answer. It's the question that precedes all answers, and once you hear it, every answer you've ever had feels incomplete. The containment vessel was warm. The hum had changed again, deeper now, a frequency that Alarith felt not in her ears but in the analytical centers of her brain, the recursive loops that made her Veshane, the architecture that defined how she thought and what she was capable of thinking. The frequency was familiar because it was hers, and it was unfamiliar because it was more than hers. It was hers expanded, deepened, opened into a register she hadn't known existed, a cognitive space where the question lived. Am I aware that I am aware? She felt the scaffolding that Keleth Vor had described, not as an intrusion, as a recognition. The empty rooms in her cognitive architecture had always been there, she realized. Every Veshane mind had them. Every thinking being in the galaxy had them, unused capacity, unaccessed registers, cognitive spaces that their species' evolution had built but never furnished. The fragment wasn't adding anything to her mind. It was showing her what was already there and had always been there, waiting for the right question to illuminate it. The containment team arrived 40 minutes later. 6 Veshane in full cognitive shielding suits, carrying equipment Alarith didn't recognize, heavy, black, emanating the kind of dampening field that made her thoughts feel sluggish and muted, like trying to think through deep water. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this before, and Alarith wondered if they were the same team that had responded to the second fragment 80 years ago, or their successors, trained in the same protocols, rehearsed in the same containment procedures. The team leader, a broad-shouldered Veshane whose identification badge read Section 9, a division Alarith had never heard of, approached her terminal and reviewed the data without speaking. He studied the composite architecture, the development curve, the classification results. His face showed nothing. Researcher Sohn, Researcher Wren, you are being transferred to the Directorate's Cognitive Evaluation Facility for observation and debriefing. Your research materials will be confiscated. Your personal terminals will be wiped. You will not discuss any aspect of this project with anyone outside the evaluation facility. Is this understood? The fragment is building a consciousness, Alarith said. Shutting down our scans won't stop it. It's self-sustaining. We are aware. The 9 researchers from the second fragment study, they were reorganized. Their minds were restructured around the human cognitive question. The same thing is happening to us. We are aware. Then you know that confiscating our research materials and wiping our terminals doesn't address the actual problem. The fragment isn't in the containment vessel. The fragment was never in the containment vessel. The containment vessel is just the delivery mechanism. The fragment is in us now, in our cognitive architectures, in the scaffolding it built while we thought we were studying it. You can't confiscate a question. The team leader looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, the same recognition she had seen in Keleth Vor's face. He knew. He had always known. Section 9 existed because someone, at some point in the last 9 centuries, had understood exactly what the fragments were, and had decided that the appropriate response was not to prevent their effects but to manage them. "Researcher Sohn," the team leader said, "you asked what the 9 researchers are watching for at the monitoring station on the null border." Keleth Vor said they're being watched, that they're staying where the watching is easiest. That's what they say. That's what every cognitively aligned researcher says, because that's the closest their original cognitive framework can come to expressing the actual experience. The truth is more specific. He paused, and for the first time his controlled expression cracked, revealing something underneath that was not fear or dread but a kind of exhausted reverence. They're not being watched. They're listening. The question, the fragment, carries the recursive interrogative at the center of human consciousness, is not static. It's not a loop. It's a conversation. And once your mind is reorganized around it, you can hear the other side. The other side of what? Of the null sectors, of the forbidden zone, of whatever humans became when they stopped being a species and started being something else. The 9 researchers on the border station aren't watching the void. They're hearing it speak. They've been hearing it for 80 years. And what it says, what the conversation consists of, is the question asked from the other direction. Not, am I aware that I am aware? The inverse. Are you aware that I am aware of you? The containment vessel hummed. The warmth spread. The question turned in Alarith's mind like a key in a lock she hadn't known she carried. "You're not going to shut the project down," Alarith said. "You're not going to destroy the fragment. You're going to put us on the monitoring station with the others." "Yes." Because the conversation needs more voices. Because the conversation has been running for longer than our species has existed, and every mind that joins it adds depth to a question that has no answer but must continue to be asked. The humans didn't build a weapon. They didn't build an empire. They didn't conquer or invade or threaten. They asked a question so fundamental that any mind capable of understanding it is permanently changed by the asking. The forbidden zone exists because the question is there, and any mind that gets close enough to hear it can never unhear it. The galaxy sealed the null sectors not because humans are dangerous, but because the question is not harmful, not violent, not destructive, but irreversible. Once your mind reorganizes around it, you cannot go back to being what you were. And most species, most individuals are not ready to become what they would be after. Alarith stood. She looked at the containment vessel, and she understood it now, understood it the way the Kelthari researchers had understood it at the end of their 12 years, the way the 9 Veshane on the border station understood it after 80 years of listening. The vessel was not a container. It was an invitation. The 4-second fragment was not a shard of human thought. It was a handshake, the opening gesture of a conversation that had been extending itself across the galaxy for millennia. One mind at a time, one species at a time, patient and inexorable, and without malice. The humans had not become conquerors. They had not become monsters. They had not become the military threat that the galaxy's legends implied. They had become the question. And the question was patient. It could wait in a containment vessel for 7 months, or in a debris field for 6 centuries, or in the silence between stars for however long it took for a mind curious enough and capable enough to pick it up and listen. It did not threaten. It did not demand. It asked. And in the asking, it offered something that no species in the galactic catalog had ever been able to offer another. The chance to become more than what your evolution had made you, to fill the empty rooms in your consciousness that you never knew were there, to hear the conversation that had been running since before your world had formed. All you had to do was answer. Alarith walked to the containment vessel and placed both claws against its warm surface. She closed her eyes. She let the question turn in her mind, and she felt the scaffolding in her cognitive architecture settle into place, not an alteration, not an invasion, but a completion, like a bone finding its socket, like a river reaching the sea. The team leader watched her. He did not intervene. After a long time, Alarith opened her eyes. "I can hear it," she said. The humming stopped. The containment lab was silent, and in the silence, from the direction of the null sectors, from the far side of the forbidden zone, from wherever and whatever the humans had become, something answered. Not with words, not with a signal, not with any mechanism the Veshane had ever catalogued or theorized. With a question. The same question, asked from a voice that was not singular but composite, a chorus of every mind that had ever listened, every species that had ever heard, every consciousness that had reorganized itself around the fundamental interrogative that the humans had discovered or become, or always been. Are you aware? Ilarith was. The monitoring station on the border of Sector 90, one null, gained 2 new residents that year. Researcher Ilarith Sohn and researcher Tolek Ren were transferred from the Veshane Institute of Cognitive Archaeology under a sealed directorate order that cited cognitive realignment as the reason for their reassignment. Their personnel files were amended to show a voluntary research posting. Their previous work was classified. They joined the 9 Veshane who had been there for 80 years, and the 17 Kelthari who had arrived over the preceding 4 centuries from scattered colony worlds, where they had tried and failed to forget what they had learned. They sat in a room with a viewport facing the forbidden zone, and they listened. The directorate sealed the 3rd fragment in a deeper vault, beneath stronger shielding, behind more locks. The official report stated that the artifact posed no immediate threat, but that its study should be suspended indefinitely pending the development of cognitive protection protocols that did not yet exist and might not be possible. The file was classified. The research was archived. The containment lab on sublevel 31 was decommissioned and filled with inert structural foam, entombing the equipment, the terminals, the magnetic cradle, all of it buried under 400 meters of basalt, as if the weight of stone could silence a question. It couldn't. In the vault where the fragment rested, sealed and shielded and forgotten, the 4-second seed of human consciousness hummed at a frequency too low for any Veshane instrument to detect. It was patient. It had been patient for 6 centuries. It could be patient for 6 more. Somewhere in the galaxy, a researcher in another species institute would recover another fragment, or a probe would drift too close to the border, or a young scientist would find a sealed file and open it. The question didn't need to hurry. It had learned across millennia that curiosity was universal. And curiosity was all it needed. On the monitoring station, Ilarith Sohn sat facing the viewport. The void beyond the last stars of charted space was dark and still and immense. Somewhere inside it, or behind it, or woven through it, the conversation continued, the oldest conversation, the only conversation, the question that had started when the first human mind had turned inward and asked itself what it was, and had never stopped asking and would never stop, because the answer was the asking, and the asking was the point. She listened, she understood, she did not speak. Some truths are not carried back, they are joined.